أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والصلاة والسلام على خير المرسلين وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم سبحانك اللهم لا علم لنا إلا ما علمتنا إنك أنت العليم الحكيم. Bismillah. So welcome back. Regular attendees know that we've been going through the section relating to the freeing of slaves and to wasiyah, which is what a person leaves in a will for people after his death. So that was what we were talking about last time. And we were going through the various ways that slaves were freed. We haven't got to the main one, which is simply freeing a slave, called itq. But we've talked about all of these other types of ways, which is tadbir, for example, which is when you tell a slave, you are free the moment I pass away, which is a contract between you and the slave. Or wasiyah, which is when you write in your will that a particular slave is to be freed, which is similar, but not exactly the same thing because it has a slightly different weight to it. Or the freeing of a slave at a certain date in the future. These are the types of freeing that we've talked of so far. Obviously, with all of these ones, you do get something for it. And basically, with the first two, you get all the benefits of having a slave, and you're taking it away from the people who come after you when you free the slave on your death. So that's why that falls under the third, because you're actually impacting what comes for the people after you rather than what is your own wealth. So we've gone through those various stages. Then we come to the next one, which is a very important one, which is mentioned in the Book of Allah in Surah Nur, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَكَاتِبُوهُمُ إِنْ عَلِمْتُمْ فِيهِمْ خَيْرًا, and agree a kitaba, a particular type of contract called a kitaba, with them if you know of good in them. So this was a particular, this good could apply at a personal level, but also in terms of this slave having the skill to earn khayr, which is wealth. So, when slaves have an ability with wealth, they're good merchants, or they have a skill set, such as they're a carpenter or electrical electrician in the modern world or something like that can earn them money, and they also were people of good character, then it was recommended in the deen to let those people go their own way, but do it in a way that they work for it. So you still get some benefit out of it, and that person then can do the work that enables them to then be freed at some point in the future. And this was done in agreement for payments that were made at specific points in the future. And you would agree maybe one such payment or 10 such payments or 20 such payments. And these were known as nujum, the same word as for star in Arabic, and najm. Each one was a particular installment that was paid. So this is kitaba, and it is recommended, as I said, in the Book of Allah. And once you've agreed it, it cannot be withdrawn by the person the owner. He can't say, okay, I've changed my mind. You've paid for half of them, but actually I don't want to do this anymore. It's not allowed to withdraw it. The only time when this contract can be ended is when either the slave says, I can't do it anymore, or the party rules that the slave has not showing the ability to do it anymore. In which case, the contract ends and the slave reverts back to his original status, which was a slave. So he says here, wal mukatab abdun, this person who is called a mukatab, this person who has agreed a kitaba with his owner to work to pay off his freedom. And he's not paying off his freedom bit by bit, by the way. This is why it's important to say this. It's not, for example, he's paid off 90% and he's now 90% free. Let's say his owner agrees with him that he pays 10 dinars every year for the next 10 years, and he then pays off 90 dinars over 9 years, and then says, I can't do it anymore. Or proves unable to do it anymore for some other reason, and the Qadi rules that is the case. He's not now 90% free. He goes back to being a full slave completely. So it's something that you're only free upon completion of it. So there's another thing that's called a muqata'a, which is a similar thing, but that's when the slave buys his own freedom immediately, or even when he has a kitaba, he can agree say he's got a kitaba for 10 years, and then he can agree a different amount. Say, look, instead of that kitaba, can I pay you now, let's say 120 dinars now, and we scrap the kitaba, and then I'm free. That's also. But then he's free the moment he pays it. But this, he's not free until he's paid all of it. That's the important thing in this particular contract. So he says here, a muqatab is a slave so long as anything remains for him to pay back, but to him to pay. Even if it's just like 1 dirham. He agreed for 1,000 dirhams, he paid 999. Until that last dirham is paid, he's still a slave. But the difference between him and other slaves is, as we mentioned before, when a person is a slave, it is within the power of the owner, but it's not something that he should do, but it's within his power to take property away from that slave. But a mukatab, that cannot be done to him. You're not allowed to take anything away from a kitab. And now all of his property is sacrosanct, cannot be touched the moment you make that agreement with him, because he needs it. You need money to earn money, basically. But you buy, because most of the time people would do it buying equipment, you would buy things to go and sell, and so on and so forth. And he has to also be given time to work for himself. So while he is still your slave, and he has to give some time to you to do the job, to do certain jobs, you have to give him enough time to be able to work to earn his living as well for himself. So that's another important aspect of a mukatab, a slight difference. Wal kitaba jaiza, it is permitted to agree a kitaba in terms of what you pay for this kitaba for anything that the two people agree, so long as it's halal to own it. So whatever you as the slave and me as the owner agree, whether it's 100 camels or a house or 10 kilos of dates, whatever it is that you agree, that is what you have to pay on the dates that are agreed. Well, kitaba jaiza ala ma radiyahu al-abdu was-sayyid, based upon what the slave and the owner agree between them, min al-mal, of any sort of wealth. So it's a physical thing. It's not just doing things for you. It's actually something physical. Munajjaman, that is paid in installments. Qallat an-nujumu aw kathran, whether that's a few installments, 1 or 2, or whether it's a lot of installments, 100. 100 for the next 100 months, you have to give me the such and such. فَإِنْ عَجَزَ رَجَعَ رَقِيقًا. If he proves unable to complete the task, then he goes back to being a slave. Or if he had been a mudabbar beforehand, he goes back to being a mudabbar. Because obviously a mukatab can earn his freedom before a mudabbar. The mudabbar has to wait until his owner passes away. So you can agree a kitaba with a full slave or with a slave who's going to be freed anyway, just to enable that slave to get free more quickly. فَإِنْ عَجَزَ رَجَعَ رَقِيقًا, he goes back to being a slave in the same way that he was. وَحَلَّ لَهُ مَا أُخِذَ مِنْهُ. وَحَلَّ, the owner, it is halal for him to keep everything that he's been paid. He doesn't have to return it to the slave. So as I said, if he's been paid 999 out of 1,000 and then the slave can't complete it, that 999 does not then become a debt that the owner has to pay back to the slave. It becomes halal for him to keep. The slave, because that's one of the things, when you take on this kitaba, it's an agreement between both parties. You are doing it based upon your knowing the implications of it and knowing what capacity you have. So you'd be very stupid to agree to something that you don't have the capacity to undertake. Because you'll be working harder, obviously, as a kitaba. You'll be doing this other work as well as your normal chores, basically. وَلَا يُعَجِّزُهُ أو يُعْجِزُهُ إِلَّا السُّلْطَانِ. Nobody can declare this slave to be incapable of completing his work. In other words, the owner can't simply say, oh, I find you incapable now. I'm taking all that you've given me and I'm scanning this because I think that you're not capable of doing it. That's not up to him. The only person who's allowed to do that is what he calls here the Sultan. Now, obviously, when we hear the word Sultan, we think of the Amir al-Mu'mineen, the leader of all the Muslims. But if you look in the books of fiqh, this word Sultan simply means the authorities. Whether that is a local authority, whether that's a court authority, or whether that is the Sultan himself. So anybody who represents the Sultan in having authority over the people, he is the Sultan. Very often this was the Qadi. So most often this was the Qadi. The Qadi would make this decision. The case would be brought to him, and then he would hear what people had to say, and he would look into it, and then he would give what's called a ba'at talawwum after he's given. So he wouldn't say, okay, I find you incapable. This kitaba is at an end. You go back to being a slave. No, he gives him a period of time to find a way of getting around the issue that's stopping him from being able to complete it. And he does that based upon what he sees of the person in front of him and what he sees of his capacity and what he sees as the reason why this person's not able to do it. So his own ijtihad comes into this. So it's not a specific period of time. It's not like it's a week or a month. It depends upon the situation in front of him. So he sees the guy, he says, okay, right, you're showing signs of not being able to do it, but maybe it's just because you're ill and you're going to recover from this illness, for example. So he says, okay, I'll give you a month. If still in a month's time, you're still not doing what you need to do and not paying off what you need to pay off, then I'm sorry, but this kitab is an end. إذا امتنع من التعجيز. So that is if the Sultan decides it, if the slave denies that he is incapable. If the slave admits, okay, yeah, I know I can't do it anymore. I'm not going to be able to do it. I'm done. I can't complete this. Then you don't need to go to the Qadi. That in itself is enough. So you only go to the Qadi when the owner says he's not doing it. He's incapable now. He's not doing the work and he's missing the deadlines for the payments. And the owner and their slave says, no, I'm working on it. It's en route. If that's the case, then they go to the Qadi because there's a dispute now. If the slave says, okay, yeah, no, I can't do it, then that's it. It's finished. The kitab is finished without any involvement of the Qadi. وكل ذات رحم فولده أو فولدها بمنزلتها من مكاتبة أو مدبرة. So any woman who is made a mukataba, by dhati rahim he means a female slave. Any female slave who is made a mukataba by her owner, if she then has children while she is in the state, after she has been made a mukataba, those children have the same status as her. In other words, they do the work alongside her. So if he agrees that it's going to be for 1,000 paid over in 10 installments over the next 5 years, then the children can help her in that work. Obviously, they're probably too young at that point to do it. But let's say it's for a 30-year period. Then the children, when they're old enough to start working, they can start helping their mum to pay this. The amount's not increased because of the children. Still the same amount that they have to pay, and they can help their mum pay it off. And when their mum's free, they're free. They follow their mother in this. And he says here, the same applies to any other slave, female slave who's freed in any of these ways. If a female slave is made a mudabbara, or is given her freedom at some specific point in the future, or these are the specific ones, or she is marhuna, she is left as collateral with somebody, because sometimes when that happens, obviously the person will take the collateral if the person defaults on the debt. In any of these cases, her children always go with her. The children that she has after that agreement is made, or they have the same ruling as her. Children before have a different, separate agreement with them. And we go into that in a little bit. The same, and he also then adds another one, and the walad. So an walad, I think, did we go through an walad at all previously, last time? I think we go through it today. An walad is a woman who has born a child or become pregnant by her owner. So the owner has made her pregnant. She immediately, upon it being determined by experts that she is indeed pregnant, even if she then miscarries, if there is a fetus of any sort, and it is known by the experts to be a pregnancy, then she is deemed to be an walad. If she has children by the owner, those children are automatically free the moment they're born, because their father is free. If she has children from other people after she is made an walad, so maybe she becomes an walad and then she marries somebody and then she has children with them, or she owns her own slaves if she's given permission to trade or anything like that, then or no, she marries us. Which for her, it's only marrying, because the women can't sleep with their male slaves in that way. But if she marries somebody and then has children with somebody else, those children have the same status as her. So when her owner dies, she is freed, and those children are also freed with her. If she dies before her owner dies, then those children wait until the owner dies, and then they're free the moment the owner dies. They have the same status as her. If she had children before becoming an walad, those children remain slaves. They don't have that category. So this is only children after her status has changed that count in terms of having the same status as her. وَمَالُ الْعَبْدِ لَهُ إِلَّا أَنْ يَنْتِزَعَهُ السَّيِّدُ. Any property that a slave has belongs to him, belongs to the slave, except if the owner seizes it literally from him. In other words, the word that we use is not a nice way of taking. Intiza, sort of like a forceful thing, which indicates that it's not sort of like something that's a thing that should be done. But I suppose there could be circumstances where the owner is desperate and he sees his slave has lots of things, so he takes it from him. They might have done that in the past. Maybe they would have sometimes given it back, but they are not on any obligation to do that. So he says here, except if the owner seizes it from him, if he frees him or makes him a mukatab and does not exclude the slave's wealth. So let's say you have a wealthy slave here, and then the owner comes to him and says, you're free. If he simply says, you're free, I've freed you, and does not say anything about the wealth of the slave, that slave, by default, all of his wealth goes with him. So if the slave owns like 100 palm trees and 1,000 dinars and all of that sort of stuff, and then the owner comes to him and says, you're free, that does not get left with his owner. It all goes with him. It's all his. Belongs to the slave by default. But if the owner says, look, you're free, but on the condition that I'm going to take all of your wealth from you. I mean, I'm sure if this was a very highly skilled slave, he would definitely want that. But so yeah, that if he excluded it in the actual agreement, then the owner can take it. Otherwise, he can't. And that is whether he agrees a mukataba, a kitaba with him, or whether he frees him outright, or whether he makes him mudabbar, or all of these various things. وَلَمْ يَسْتَثْنِ مَالَهُ فَلَيْسَ لَهُ أَنْ يَنْتِزَعَ. He doesn't have the right to take it from him. وَلَيْسَ لَهُ وَطْءُ مُكَاتَبَتِهِ. And if he makes a female slave a mukataba, then while she is a mukataba, he is not allowed to have sexual intercourse with her, because she is now, on the path to freedom, even though she might later return to be a slave. If she does later return to be a slave, then obviously his sexual rights over her can return. But while she's a mukataba, it's not allowed for him to do that. This is different from the mudabbara, that it is allowed until his death, but not with the mukataba. Obviously, because that can impact her ability to work as well if she falls pregnant. Can have other effects. If he does do this, however, he is not given the had punishment, because it's very easy for a person to be confused and not know the ruling about this. And whenever there's what's called shubha, there are extenuating circumstances that might make a person think that it's okay, the most severe punishments are taken off the table, like had punishment. وما حدث للمكاتب والمكاتبة من ولد دخل معهما في الكتابة. So this is something he's repeating here. We mentioned before that if a mukataba or mudabbar or anybody has children, they all go with her and have the same status as her. But he's repeating it here because he wants to say that it also applies to a man in terms of kitaba, but not those other things. So if a man is made mukatab, he said, you will have your freedom if you pay me 10 installments over the next 10 years of such and such. And then, with his own slave or his own wife, he has children after that. Those children enter into the kitaba contract with him. And they are freed alongside him when he is freed, or they return to being slaves if he returns to being slaves. They have the exact same status as him. And they can help him. And as we're going to come to you, it doesn't necessarily have to be just children, by the way. Other people can be brought into a kitaba contract alongside a person if the owner agrees, or if it's agreed in the initial contract, to make it easier to complete sometimes. Or it might be with a group of people, as we're going to come to. So it's a huge amount. He says, look, all you guys together, you must give me 1,000 dinars and then you're all free. That's another scenario that might have a group of 20 slaves and say, look, I want 1,000 dinars from you guys. And then when you've done that, you're all free. So that's the next one he comes to here. He says, وَتَجُوزُ كِتَابَةُ الْجَمَاعَةِ. It is permitted for a man to agree a kitaba with a whole group of slaves. وَلَا يَعْتِقُونَ إِلَّا بِأَدَاءِ الْجَمِيعِ. But none of them are freed until all of it is paid. So, sometimes, you could have like a lot of people, and the amount that each one is expected to do depends upon his individual capacities. So it's not an assumption that if you do a kitaba with 20 slaves, that they are all going to do equal work. Basically, the way the work of each one is decided is by the capacity and skill set of each of the individual ones. And so that's worked out at the beginning. Then if one of them becomes unable to, falls ill or whatever it is, and the other ones have to take on the workload, or one of them simply lazy and doesn't do the workload, it doesn't stop that one being freed. But what happens afterwards is when they are all freed, then they claim back the share that he should have paid from him. It's a debt that he has to give the other ones. That's basically the way it works. But it still all has to be paid before any of them is free. So, if you're going to agree to be part of a group in that way, then you better make sure that the rest of the group are going to be doing what needs to be done. Otherwise, you might find yourself with a huge workload and all of these other people who suddenly become your debtors afterwards, but you've done, basically worked yourself to the bone. It is possible for some to be freed before the others, but only if they all agree, basically. For example, if one is not pulling his weight anymore, then, he might be given his, the owner might say, I'm freeing him now. Or maybe it's one as a favorite. So the owner says, look, I'm freeing this guy now. This owner has 20 slaves. He makes this kitab with all of them, but one of them is one he really likes. So he says, half a year later, okay, you can go free now. You don't have to wait with the others. Obviously, what's this doing to the others? They just lost one worker who would have been helping them to pay this off. So it's made things harder on the others. So the others do not have to accept that. They can actually scotch that freeing and say, no, look, he's with us. We don't accept him being freed now because it makes things too hard for us. So even though you think automatically when somebody's free, automatically it should be allowed, there's instances where other people are relying on that person. But if the person who is freed is somebody who is basically useless now because they are so ill that they can't do any work, then it doesn't require the permission of the others anymore because he's not going to be helping them anyway. So there's lots of these sort of small little things that sort of break the general pattern of the rule. But it's obviously like it shows that it's human. It's not all just black and white. It depends on circumstance, a lot of these things. There are generic rules or general rules, but there are many, many situations where those rules do not have to be followed because of circumstances. وَلَيْسَ لِلْمُكَاتَبِ إتق ولا إتلاف ماله حتى يعتق. So عتق يعتق. I suppose it could be يعتق or يعتق. It means to go free. يعتق is when he's physically freed. يعتق simply means that he goes free. But anyway, he says here وَلَيْسَ لِلْمُكَاتَبِ إتق. A mukatab himself cannot free slaves of his own, because the slaves of slaves, if he goes back to being a slave, can be taken by the owner. So in a sense, are almost his property. So he is sort of taking away property that could go back to the owner by doing that. And similarly, he can't simply give things away within reason. He can do it within reason, like an udhiyya and things like that. But he can't just sort of like have 1,000 dinars and find somebody and say, "Oh, I'm going to give 900 of my dinar, 1,000 of my dinars away," while he's in his kitabah, because obviously that's going to affect his ability to be able to complete that kitabah. And the reason why the owner allowed him to do that was because this person had wealth that would enable him to make wealth. So if he suddenly stops that, then it's an issue. So it's not. So he says he's not allowed to waste his money, itlafu malihi, until he is free. Then when he's free, he can do whatever he wants with it. وَلَا يَتَزَوَّجْ. Nor is he allowed to marry. He's not allowed to marry because, again, a slave being married is considered to be something that reduces the value of a slave. And so it's something that will remain should he fail and return to being a slave. But they were allowed to have what was called sariya, yatasarra, which is to have slave women of their own who they had relations with. It was just the marriage thing was not allowed, except if the owner said, okay, it's fine. All of this is without the permission of the owner, basically. وَلَا يُسَافِرُ السَّفَرَ الْبَعِيدِ بِغَيْرِ إِذْنِ سَيِّدِهِ. Nor is he allowed to go on a long journey. And by a long journey, this is the sort of journey where he's going to be away when his next installment is due. That's the reason it's not allowed. Not because there's anything wrong with traveling. But if he, in the modern era, there wouldn't probably be any issue. If the installments were months apart and you can travel to any land in a day, then obviously this prohibition would be removed, because it's simply about him not being there to pay something at a particular time when he has promised to pay it. That's why that's not allowed. So it's to do with him lessening his ability to be able to earn and stopping himself being in a place where he can pay the thing that he needs to pay at the time that he needs to pay it. I mean, a lot of these things, we are going through them in detail, even though they don't really happen in the modern era. But the reason why these types of rulings need to be preserved, they need to be preserved, is because the fact that we're not doing something now does not mean that there won't be a situation where these rulings will need to be understood again. So you need to keep alive all parts of the fiqh, even those that cannot be implemented now. I mean, in fact, going through the books of buying and selling, how many of those things are actually being implemented in the modern era? I mean, unfortunately, very, very few. Very, very few. وَإِذَا مَاتَ وَلَهُ وَلَدٌ. So if the mukatab, this guy who's paying off his own freedom in installments, if he dies halfway through and he has children now who have joined him in this mukatab, this kitaba. وَأَدَّى مِن مَالِهِ مَا بَقِيَ عَلَيْهِ حَالًا. And while he's been doing this kitaba, he's been paying off the installments, but at the same time, he's been acquiring wealth of his own. He's becoming independently wealthy. Because obviously this mukatab, let's say he agrees a kitaba of 10 years, paying 10 dinars every year. He may be earning 100 dinars every year. So this would then become part of his own wealth. And he'd just be paying off the amounts that he needs to pay off each year, but while living a nice, comfortable life himself. So this is a very, very likely possibility. So if this guy halfway through dies, so after 5 years paying 5 lots of 10 dinars, he keels over and dies. And he has children. He's had children during this time that he was doing this kitaba. And he leaves behind a lot of wealth as well. So what happens in this scenario, he says? Because when a slave dies, the master takes the possession of the slave. So this guy, in some ways, appeared to be a slave at the moment he died, because we said at the beginning, a mukatab is a slave as long as the whole thing has not been paid yet. So the question now is, so what happens in this scenario when he's only paid half of it, but he has plenty of money that could pay off the remainder? They say what happens here is, after he dies, all the remainder that he owes becomes due immediately. So that's the remaining 50 in the scenario we talked about. That's taken from his estate and paid to the owner, making him now free. And now because he's free, his children can now inherit from him, because his children are also free. So let's say this man left 100 dinars. 50 of those dinars goes to the owner, finishing off the remaining amount that was due for the kitaba. Then the rest of the 50 is inherited by his children. And obviously the sons getting twice what the daughters get, basically. So that's what happens in this particular scenario. وَوَرِثَ مَنْ مَعَهُ مِنْ وَلَدِهِ مَا بَقِيَ. And any children who are with him in the kitaba, this only applies to the children who are with him in the kitaba, in his kitaba. If he had other children before that, those other children will have a different status. They will not have this same status of being mukatab and sharing in the same kitaba. So even if they are free, the other kids, they don't inherit from this particular man, because it needs to be this half freedom, that they have the same status as him to inherit from him. So it's a slightly complicated scenario, but it's to make sure that all of the work that he did, his children will continue to enjoy it so long as he had the means to pay off the remainder. And this applies also if a man dies. I think maybe he comes to this. Well, no, he doesn't mention it exactly. But if I agree a mukataba with two people who are not related to each other, and they both are doing the work, again, let's say over 10 years, 10 dinars every year, and then one of them dies halfway through, when they've paid 50 of those dinars, and the one who died had quite a lot of money when he died. Didn't have any children or anything, but he was in the same kitaba with some other dude. The remainder of it is paid off by that person who died. So it's completely paid off, and the other one is freed from it being paid off. Because otherwise, all of that money would simply go back to the owner. وَإِنْ لَمْ يَكُنْ فِي الْمَالِ وَفَاء. If there's not enough money in his estate to pay off the kitaba in full, فَإِنَّ وَلَدَهُ يَسْعَوْنَ فِيهِ وَيُؤَدُّونَ نُجُومًا إِنْ كَانُوا كِبَارًا. If his children are already adult by the time he's died, so let's say he died and there was 50 dinars left to be paid off, and he only had an estate of 30 dinars when he died, those 30 dinars will go to pay off some of it, leaving 20, and the kids Or actually, what you would actually normally happen in this is the 30 dinars would go to the kids, if these kids are trustworthy and have the ability to work, to enable them to do what needs to be done to earn the money to pay off the remainder. So that's the main system here. If the kids are old enough to do that and have the skill set and the level of trust to be able to do that, because this money that's being given to them, they need to have trust and rushd, an ability to use money in order for it to be worthwhile at all. So there's different scenarios here. A man dies leaving children. Whether he has enough to pay off the kitaba or not, that's the first question. If he has enough, then the children are all freed and they inherit whatever remains. If he does not have enough, then you look at the children now. Are these children old enough to work? And do they have the requisite skill set to be able to actually bring money in? And are they trustworthy with money? If so, then whatever money is in his estate is given to them to use to help them do the work to bring in the rest of the money. If they are not, or they are too young to work, then you look at the amount of money that was left and you check, will this be enough to pay off until the time that they reach an age where they will be able to do that? So let's say they are 12 or they are 2 years away from puberty or whatever, and they have the ability to work from puberty. And there's five years worth of 10 still owing, and the estate is enough to pay for the next 2 years. Then you take that 2 years worth, and they remain at their status until they reach that point, in which case they start working for the last 3 years to pay it off. If they are too young and there's not enough money to pay for that, they all go back to being slaves. So there's lots of different scenarios here. These must have been very, very frequent situations that these sorts of things arose. And there are lots of different permutations. So they basically try and cover their bases with these various rulings. And obviously, sometimes alongside these children, there would be the mother of these children, which would usually have been the what's called the walad of the mukatab, as a slave woman that he'd had, from whom he'd had children, because normally they wouldn't have been married because they would have required the owner's submission. So that mother could also work alongside the children. So if they didn't have the capacity and she did, then they would allow her to do the work. So there's various different scenarios that are followed by this. وإن كانوا صغارا وليس في المال قدر النجوم إلى بلوغهم السعي رقوا. If they are still small and there is not enough in the estate of the deceased mukatab to pay for the nujum, the installments, until the time that they reach the ability to work, then raqu, they are returned to being slaves. وإن لم يكن له ولد معه في كتابته ورثه سيده. If he dies and he doesn't have any children or anyone else to inherit from him who was in the kitaba alongside him, then all of the money goes to the owner on the basis of ownership. It's not really, he uses the word waritha, inheritance, but it's not really inheritance in the sense that an owner doesn't really inherit from his slave. He simply takes his property. So it's not really inheritance. It's simply there's nobody else to take the property. So he takes it, basically. وَمَنْ أَوْلَدَ أَمَةً. So this is the walad now, he explains it. He said, if somebody makes a slave woman of his be with child, then what rights does he now have over this woman? So if a woman becomes an walad, she falls pregnant to her owner, does her status while she's still in his possession change, or is it simply that she's freed after his death? He says no. Her status now changes. Firstly, because he's made her pregnant, he's still allowed to have sexual relations with her, because they've already been sexually involved. So there's no reason to stop him being allowed to have sexual relations with her anymore. So he's allowed to do that fi hayatihi, while he's still alive. وَتُعْتَقُ مِنْ رَأْسِ مَالِهِ بَعْدَ مَمَاتِهِ, and she is freed from his entire estate before any debts or anything else is paid, the moment he dies. وَلَا يَجُوزُ بَيْءُهَا. He's not allowed to sell her or give her away after she becomes an walad. وَلَا لَهُ عَلَيْهَا خِدْمَةٌ. And he's not allowed to have her work for him anymore. She can't be made to do any chores, apart from, they say, very small things like baking bread or things like that. She's not allowed to do anything strenuous anymore, because now she's the mother of his free son. So she has a status here. She's not simply a servant. So she's not allowed to be worked anymore. And وَلَا غُلَّ. And she's not allowed to be hired out to others to work for other people. He's not allowed to use her as a slave, basically, anymore, even though she's still owned by him. The only right that he has over her now is sexual, because he's having a child with her, very much like a wife now. He's not allowed to do all of the normal things that you think of with a slave. She's not really a slave anymore, and she's freed the moment he dies, fully free. وَلَهُ ذَلِكَ فِي وَلَدِهَا مِنْ غَيْرِهِ وَهُوَ بِمَنْزِلَةِ أُمِّهِ فِي الْعِتْقِ يُعْتَقُ بِعِتْقِهَا. If this woman, this walad, he has a child with her, then she marries somebody else after him. Their relationship ends, and now she gets married. If she has children after having become his walad with somebody else, the question is, what's the status of those children? So the first thing he says, well, those children are still slaves while the owner is alive. So he can make use of those children as you would any other slave while he is alive. But those children have the same status of their mother after his death. So those children, despite not being his children, they are freed the moment he dies. So an walad, there are three possible categories of kids she could have. She could have children that she had before becoming an walad. So let's say, she had a husband, then divorced her husband, and with that husband she had children. Then her owner had sexual relations with her and had children with her. Then her owner stopped having sexual relations with her and she married somebody else and had children with that other person. These three categories. The first category of children, they remain slaves, because she was not an walad when she had them. The second category of children, they are free the moment they're born, because their father is free. The third category of children, they are freed when the owner dies, the same way that their mother is, basically. Those are the three different categories of children that she has. وكل من أسقطته مما يعلم أنه ولد فهي به ولد. So if she falls pregnant and then miscarries, whatever she miscarries, if it is clear that what she miscarried was on the path to being a fetus or a human being, it's clearly not just menstrual blood, then by simply her having fallen pregnant and then having miscarried that fetus, she is an walad. The walad literally means the mother of a child that's been born. But she's saying here, no, it doesn't actually have to be born as a child that's reached full term. It could be simply an unborn, or it has to be born, but it could simply be a fetus in the first stage of development. That's enough to make her an walad from her owner. وَلَا يَنْفَعُهُ الْعَزْلِ. If he acknowledges that he had sexual intercourse with her, and he doesn't claim istibra', which we're going to come to, says, yeah, okay, I had sexual intercourse with her, but I pulled out. I didn't ejaculate in her. Before I ejaculated, I pulled out. So I have no idea how come she's pregnant with my child. It's impossible. If he says that doesn't mean anything. The fact that he acknowledged having sexual intercourse with her is enough for the child to be declared to be his. We're not doing DNA tests here. Basically, if he acknowledges that he was sleeping with this woman, and then she gives birth 6 months or more afterwards, from the period of time that he acknowledges he was sleeping with her, then I know it's a possibility she could have been sleeping with somebody else as well, but his claim that it can't be his because he pulled out is not given any credence whatsoever. And so she's categorized as being an walad. إذا أنكر ولدها, if he says, no, it's not possible that it's my kid, I deny paternity. وأقر بالوضع, but it says, yeah, okay, it's not my child, but yes, I did have sexual intercourse with her. فإن ادعى استبراء, if he claims, look, she had a menstrual period after I had sexual intercourse with her, so there's no way it could be mine. Only one for a slave woman. I know, but this is. But if he claims, look, she had a period after I had sexual intercourse with her, so there's no way that he can be mine, and the child is born 6 months or more after this period, then his claim is given credence. But if he says, no, look, I had sexual intercourse with her, and then she had a period, and then the child is born 4 months later, there's no credence paid whatsoever to his claim then, because it's impossible for a womb to be clear and a child to come out of that womb 4 months later. So there are two things here. Yes, his word is believed over hers when it comes to a claim that she had a period and then he didn't have intercourse with her after she had a period. But it has to be possible. It has to also be possible. And if he does that, then he can't later on say, okay, it's my son. Because he's denied paternity now of this kid. So it's a denial of paternity. So that's not considered to be his child now. So he says, and he didn't have sexual intercourse with her after she had a period. لم يلحق به ما جاء من ولد. Any child that is later born cannot be attributed to him. He cannot be considered to be the father of that child.
This thing is decided anyway in Quran. That's when the woman she can be pregnant if she has only one period, but when she has another,
but the ruling that is taken with slave women is that one is enough. Now, for the vast majority of women, as very, very few women have periods when they are pregnant. It can happen, but it's very, very rare. It's very, very rare. So the benefit of the doubt when it comes to free people and slaves is given to the free people in those scenarios. There's a whole thing when it comes to claims and oaths and witnesses and all of the ways these things are done in court. So basically, there are situations where if you make a claim, you have to also make an oath. And your claim alone is not accepted without you making an oath. This is not one of them. When he makes this claim, if he claims all of this, it's between him and Allah. You see? There are things that, Allah rules on and things that the court deals with. The court has a particular way of dealing with it, and the rulings in this world are based upon what the court decides. Now, some things, you may be in the wrong, but the ruling that has to be made is based upon the way the court system works. So if he makes this claim, then his word is taken. If he's lying, that's then between him and Allah. He's obviously now lost his connection to that child. That child won't be able to inherit. If this child turns up to be some incredible child who rises to great heights, he doesn't have a connection with him. So he could also lose out by doing this. But it has consequences. Claims and oaths and witnesses and all these things have consequences. وَمَنْ أَعْتَقَ بَعْدَ عَبْدِهِ. Oh no, before he comes, he says, وَلَا يَجُوزُ إِتْقُ مَنْ أَحَاطَ الدَّيْنُ بِمَالِهِ. So now we're moving on to itq. And itq is when you free a slave on the spot. You say, you are free. This is something that's highly recommended in the deen of Allah, especially obviously you should take into account the slave in front of you and whether that slave has the ability to be on his own after you've freed them. So usually you would free a slave that's already Rashid. When it comes to freeing, when you have slaves that you have to free, you actually cannot free. For example, if you are commanded, if you are doing a kafara and you take the thing of freeing a slave as paying your expiation, you have to free a slave that meets certain categories, amongst whom is that slave is capable and adult. But you are allowed to free slaves of any type. You can free Muslim slaves, you can free non-Muslim slaves, you can free male slaves, female slaves, adult slaves, child slaves. And the Messenger of Allah ﷺ said that if somebody frees a slave, for every limb of that slave that is freed, a limb of his is freed from the fire. So, I mean, it's a pretty big thing. I mean, that's one of the reasons that certain people would have wanted to have slaves. By the way, the proof of the walad, that a female slave is freed, is from the Messenger of Allah ﷺ himself. Because when Maria al-Qibtiyya gave the Messenger of Allah ﷺ Ibrahim alayhi salam, his son Ibrahim alayhi salam, who died when he was young, he said about her, "A'taqaha ibnuha." Her son has freed her. Her son has freed her. So it's one of the signs that her bearing a son brings freedom for the mother. وَلَا يَجُوزُ إِتْقُ مَنْ أَحَاطَ الدَّيْنُ بِمَالِهِ. So if you are consumed by debt, basically you are somebody whose debts are more than all of his assets. And those, then if you are somebody in that case whose debts are more than all of your assets, you're not allowed to free any slaves that you have. Because if you do that, then that slave cannot be sold to help pay off your debt. That's like, at the same time, you're also not allowed to give away anything. So you're not allowed to do sadaqah. If your debts are more than all of your assets, and you see you want to help out somebody that you see on the street, and you want to give them like £1,000 or whatever, you're not allowed to do that, because your money then is not your own. It actually belongs to your creditors, and you can't give away what belongs to somebody else. That's not permitted. Obviously, there are certain things you are allowed to do, even in that situation. For example, if you have parents who rely on you, you can continue to support those parents. Or some people allow you, in certain cases, to have the udhiyah. But there are only sort of small things that are allowed. You're not allowed to have full reign to give away your possessions. So this is somebody whose wealth, you're not allowed to free slaves in that. And if you do free the slave is taken back into being a slave again. It doesn't count. Your freeing of the slave doesn't count. You might have got that slave's hopes up, but then as soon as the Qadi finds out, that the slave is returned to being a slave and sold, because you weren't allowed to do it. There are circumstances where if that person later becomes wealthy and then buys back that slave, there are situations where his original freeing of the slave is revisited. وَمَنْ أَعْتَقَ بَعْدَ عَبْدِهِ اسْتَتَمَّ عَلَيْهِ. So this is another thing some people used to do, and they used to do it as a way of taking the mickey or just being a bit nasty sometimes. They would say to their slave, your hand is free, but the rest of you is still a slave. Or I'm freeing 1/8 of you, or something like that. I mean, he says here, if a person does that, then the moment the Qadi finds out about it, he rules that the slave is completely free. It's not permitted. You can't just free a part of a slave in that way. It's not allowed. There are situations where slaves are part owned, but that's only when they are bought in partnership. And then one of them, as we're going to come to, one of them frees his half. So he comes into that particular scenario. He says, وَإِنْ كَانَ لِغَيْرِهِ مَعَهُ فِيهِ شَرِيكًا. So if he is a joint owner alongside somebody else of a slave, and then he frees his share of the slave. Let's say two people buy a slave, and then one of the two people frees his half of the slave. Says, whatever I own of you, you're free. He says here, what happens in that scenario? Because this is obviously not that useful for the slave. So he says here, what happens in this scenario is قُوِّمَ عَلَيْهِ نَصِيبُ شَرِيكِهِ بِقِيمَتِهِ يَوْمَ يُقَامُ عَلَيْهِ. So the value, this is from a hadith of Rasul Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, the value of his partner's portion of the slave is calculated on the day that the matter is brought before the court and it is judged that he has to be freed, and he then has to pay that value to his partner. So let's say the slave is worth 100 dinars. He frees his half, and his partner's share is worth 50 dinars. On the day, and then the Qadi discovers that he's freed half, and so he's called by the Qadi, come here, and the value on that day is 50 dinars of the half that his partner owns. If this man has money, and it doesn't necessarily mean he has money. Basically, he's treated like a muflis, like somebody who has debtors and all of it, needs to pay off all his debts. So basically, everything that he owns, apart from the clothes on his back and a few other things, they are sold. So all of that is considered to be money that he has. If you calculate all of that money, and he has enough to pay that 50 dinars, then he has to give it to his partner, and the slave is fully freed. That's because he's freed half of him. You can't just stop there. The slave needs to be fully freed now. He says here, وَأَتَقْ, and the slave goes free. He says here, فَإِنْ لَمْ يُوجَدْ مَالٌ. If he does not have any wealth after all of this is done, or perhaps he only has enough wealth to pay off a portion of that share, what happens then? He says here, basically, that بَقِيَ سَهْمُ الشَّرِيكِ رَقِيقًا. In that scenario, you can only do what you can do. You can't take away from the partner something that belongs to the partner. That's the partner's wealth. So you can't take away anything belonging to the partner. He doesn't have the means to pay. So then you're taking away the use of that slave, because if you free the slave completely now, the partner also can't use it over that period of time if you were to make it a debt. So he says here, no, what happens here is that half of the partner remains a slave. But say, you had enough money to pay 25 dinars of the remaining 50 dinars. Then he'd be expected to pay off that 25 dinars, and the slave would now be a quarter owned. What does it mean to be a quarter owned, you might ask? That means basically for every 4 days, 3 days are his to do exactly as he will, and he has to provide service for 1 day. But it also means that his wealth is now untouchable. Just do another quick little bit here, inshallah. وَمَنْ مُثَّلَ بِعَبْدِهِ مُثْلَةً بَيِّنَةً مِنْ قَطْعِ جَارِحَ وَنَحْوِهِ عُتِقَ عَلَيْهِ. So if somebody mutilates his slave, and by mutilates, he says it means basically anything such as cutting off a limb, or cutting off even the tip of a finger, or burning him, or branding him, or cutting off skin, or they even mention shaving off his beard if he's somebody who's public relations, who has to have a particular thing, or cutting the hair off of a beautiful woman, anything like that disfigures them or makes them, and if it's done deliberately, and if it's done with malice, the Qadi frees that person from him, whether he wants it to be freed or not. It doesn't pay him anything, it's free. that person is freed. This actually happened in the time of the Messenger of Allah, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, where somebody discovered a slave sleeping with somebody they shouldn't have been sleeping with. So they basically mutilated the slave in response. The Messenger of Allah, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, when he discovered this, was very angry. And basically he said, "La tuhammiluhum ma la yatiqun." Do not burden them with anything this is a general rule. Do not burden slaves with anything they are not able to do. Do not give them jobs that they can't complete. وَأَطْعِمُوهُمْ مِمَّا تَأْكُلُونَ. And feed them from the same food that you eat, with the same food that you eat. وَكُسُوهُمْ مِمَّا تَلْبِسُونَ. And give them clothing of the same types of clothes that you wear. وَمَا كَرِهْتُمْ فَبِيعُوا. Any slave that you don't like, that you have a bad relationship with, release them from your possession by selling them. وَمَا رَضِيتُمْ فَأَمْسِكُوا. But if you have a good relationship with them, then keep them. But don't, make their life a misery by keeping slaves who you have a horrible relationship with, basically. وَلَا تُعَذِّبُوهُمْ وَلَا تُعَذِّبُوا خَلْقَ اللَّهِ. Do not mutilate, do not harm, do not cause injury to the creation of Allah. So this applies to slaves because it was in this particular context, but it also applies if you own animals. You're not allowed to do that to them. Man muthila bin nari fahuwa hur. If you harm somebody by means of fire, by burning them, they are free. وَهُوَ مَوْلَى لِلَّهِ وَرَسُولِهِ. And he is the mawla of Allah and his messenger. I mean, he now becomes the responsibility of Allah and his messenger. Basically, he's freed. Whereas when it comes to with wala, it doesn't mean that the tie of wala is cut from the owner, though. But anyway. So just quickly one more here. وَمَنْ ملك أبويه أو أحدا من ولده أو ولد ولده أو ولد بناته أو جده أو جدته أو أخاه لأمه أو لأبيه أو لهما جميعا أُتِقَ عليه. So this is a scenario where somebody buys a slave and then discovers that that person is actually physically related to them that they bought. So they discover that that person is their son or their father. They didn't know that. Or their brother or their grandfather or their grandmother or their daughter or their half-brother on their mother's side or their half-brother on their father's side. Any of these scenarios where they're a very close relationship with them. He says the moment that is discovered, that person is free. That you don't have to go before a judge or anything. In fact, the moment they come into your possession, they are free. But obviously, you still have to know about it. But you're not allowed to own anybody who you are closely related to. And so if that happens, freedom is granted to them immediately. وَمَنْ أَعْتَقَ حَامِلًا كَانَ جَنِينُهَا حُرًّا مَعَهَا. And if you free somebody who is pregnant, then her child in her womb goes with her. And that's exactly for the same reason that we talked about earlier. If I say your hand is free, all of you is free. A woman's child, while it is in her womb, is considered to be part of her. So you can't say, I'm freeing you, but when that child is born, I'm taking the child back. It's not allowed. But on the other hand, if you free the child, that doesn't automatically mean the mother is free. But the mother still has right to look after the child until the child has reached the age where its adult teeth start to appear. So you can't take a child away from its mother. But you can free a child and not the mother, and it is permitted. So we'll finish there, inshallah, because the last bit just talks about kafarat. And then we'll finish that section. And then we talk about wala, which is the kinship that develops between somebody when they free someone. It creates a form of kinship, which also is created when somebody becomes Muslim at somebody's hand. That creates a type of kinship as well.
like Abu Bakr and Bilal.
Yeah. But that we'll leave that until next time. Are there any questions about any of this? I know it's not something that any of us have any personal dealings with.
We don't have to say, like in.
We don't, but then you have to understand that it's something that is permitted by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and there is a reason why this type of thing is permitted, because there is a tendency amongst human beings to exploit other human beings. Human beings are weak. We have things that are wrong with us. Some people basically are very exploitative of others. And if you have a situation where exploitation of other people is not limited by limits put into place by Allah, like this whole thing I said of the Messenger of Allah, that you feed them as from what you eat, you dress, all of these types of things, simply left open, then much worse forms of exploitation appear. People take advantage of other people. So in the modern era, you know, when you have sex trafficking, for example, or work trafficking, when people are brought in, you know, people go to work in the Emirates, for example, or Qatar for the World Cup, or any of these places, and they're paid a pittance, and all of this money is taken from the person who brought them in, and they, you know, basically work harder than slaves for nothing. Or it happens in this country as well, on plenty of farms. There's lots of occasions where people have been discovered housing lots of people who have been brought into the country by these coyotes, working to pay off their debt to the coyote for nothing. So all of these things exist. And we even have wage slavery now, where, you know, sometimes you can have a situation where you have to work 3 or 4 jobs just to basically afford to be able to eat and drink and have a roof over your head. I mean, all of these things would have been provided in the past. I mean, so all of these types of exploitation exist. So if you do not have a way of allowing this exploitation, but within limits, it creates a situation where it becomes far, far worse. So while this does not exist currently, it does not mean that there won't be a time where it is necessary for it to return.
Basically, reality.
Yeah. I mean, for example, when people are taken prisoner in jihad, or there's jihad fi sabilillah, and, you know, in the past, you know, if you release these people, they might come back and fight you the next month. Or if you killed them, that would not be good for them. They're basically, their life is ended. Or you could ransom them, but sometimes the people didn't have enough money. So what is your options at the end of the day? Because we're not a society that has massive prisons where you simply just have people in a prison draining the resources of the country to look after them. They prefer to give them to individuals to look after, which was slavery. So, I mean, there are situations where, you know, you can see why it would be actually the best of a number of bad options.
How does one become a slave?
Just going to say the same thing.
Well, so basically, the main way was through jihad in the way of Allah. But the other way was because you're not allowed to sell yourself or sell your family into slavery. That's not permitted. So the other ways would have been simply being born a slave by your parents being slaves. That were the two main ways. Either you were taken prisoner through jihad or through battle, and before jihad, when they would just go and raid. Sometimes people would just raid other tribes and take half their people. I mean, that happened a lot in the time before Islam. Yeah, but there were rules that were in place specifically for those, and that was obviously in the way that they were treated. But usually it was when you conquer a people in jihad, and they don't, because the option was the people would say, okay, we accept, and they would pay jizya, in which case they would not be enslaved. But if people fight you back, and then you're forced to fight and conquer them, then part of the pillage, the booty, was people as well as animals and land, and so these were distributed along with everything else. It's not, but I'm saying we cannot have this idea that it is inherently wrong. The Messenger of Allah himself owned slaves. The companions continued to own slaves after him. Of course, they all freed slaves plenty of times as well. They probably freed just as many slaves as they ever owned. But I mean, you can't say that the owning of slaves is something wrong if the people, if the ones whose example we follow did it. So, but I'm saying the circumstances for it do not exist currently. Because even when you come to jihad, you have to, this is jihad of offense, not jihad of defense, that by which you bring in people into that zone. And there aren't any who are born into slavery anymore, as far as I can see. I don't know if there are some countries that still have that.
I think that was in like a box that they culture they lost.
I mean, there are cultures where basically people are, to all intents and purposes, basically slaves. I mean, when I was studying Arabic, there was, in the house that I lived, there was a young girl who was living there. They were looking after her because her parents were too poor to look after all of their children. They didn't have the means to pay for all of them, so they sent some of their children to wealthy families' houses to serve them in return for them being educated and having a place to live. But during that period of time, until that passed, they would do all of the household chores.
A good exchange.
Yeah, but I'm saying, it worked for both parties in those circumstances. But I mean, it's similar, but it's not exactly the same. Anyway, we'll finish there, inshallah. Bismillahir barakatuh, bismillahir rahmanir rahim, alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen, ar-rahmanir rahim, maliki yawmiddin, iyyaka na'budu wa iyyaka nasta'in, ihdinas siratal mustaqim, siratal ladzina an'amta alayhim, ghayril maghdubi alayhim waladdallin, amin. Allahumma salli ala sayyidina Muhammadin abdika wa rasulika an-nabiyyi wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallim taslima. Subhana rabbika rabbil izzati amma yasifun wa salamun ala mursalin, alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen. Assalamu alaikum.
Next week, right?
The topic will be finishing with what's called wala here, and then we'll be moving on to shuf'a, which is property rights, things relating to, when you're a partner in property and then one of the partners wants to sell, and things like that.